Okay, welcome. It's 4/27 of 2015. We're going to look at the actual triad of praxis. Ricoeur has done all of the prep work. He's ready to move into the triad of praxis. It will include a motive, a tendency, and a fact. Motive, tendency, and fact. Under motive, he wants to emphasize that an event is that which happens, but an action is that which includes intentionality and makes things happen. So as an action, this praxis is going to be related to the notion of the true, which in the last lesson we discovered was the schema sign model, and the praxis will be related to the reflexive moment of that embodied narrative in the third virtual subject, which we posited as a workspace. And so motive of wanting is not a simple little internal entity. It is a part of the sphere of interpretation. It lives within that sphere of the sign model. So our praxis is always coupled with this linguistic interpretive act of positing a context of a greater overall ontological meaning. We posit our praxis along with a context of all-enclosing meaning. And that's called a justification for Ricoeur. We actually are justifying our positing by enclosing it within this overarching enclosure of a ontological meaning. And when we do that, then our positing, our praxis, can become a praxis of historical event that happens. So we've got the motive becoming a justification of praxis as an enclosure of a context of deeper meaning. It can become kind of looked at in a free-floating objective way. If we look at it as an objective existing entity, then we kind of transcribe it into the concept of force for Ricoeur, or you might prefer to call it tendency. I mean, you know, like Moltmann calls it tendency, but we come up with an objective concept that kind of determines that enclosure of an ontological meaning, or as a justification that takes on a power of its own. So how does this intentionality, coupled with context of meaning, how does it take on a power of its own? Second moment is that incarnating moment, and we're going to take a look at how this power can become objective and take on a self-actualizing power of its own. Because, according to Ricoeur, the context cannot be understood as a stack of propositional statements. It's more than that. That context of meaning is not reducible to a stack of propositional statements. Its structure, it's a linking motive to action. And that incarnation of linking motive to action creates the tendency. And so this can become free-floating, and if we evaluate it as kind of its own self-actualizing power, Ricoeur gives it three possible modalities. It could be something that was almost an instantaneous impulse on the part of the subject, because the subject does store a sign model in the subconscious, so it could be triggered as an impulse. Or it could be, this meaning could be triggered as a disposition, the long-term memory of actually recording the motivational base of attestation. Or it could be a structure type incidents where we basically call up the structure of the sign model and then associate portions or entities within the historical reality and find their associative place in the structure of the sign model. So we could prioritize structure and actualize the meaning that way also. There is a term for this move toward finding the objective existence of intentionality, and that is Aristotle's word of Proairesis, and that's taking intentionality and let it be restructured as participle, to understand it, to recognize it as participle. So then we get into the fact that the link to knowing, back to the sign model, becomes redefined, because now doing and knowing become coincidental. And that is praxis. Praxis is, through doing, we unveil the knowing why. That's called praxis knowledge. Our participation unveils a greater depth of truth in historical reality. We gather in that greater unveiling of depth to revise our narrative, to revise our motivational base of attestation. So doing can create the reflex of knowing, and that reflex of knowing is called praxis knowledge, because praxis knowledge is action and reflection within a particular concrete historical situation. It's praxis knowledge is action and reflection within a particular concrete historical situation. That's the definition. So that becomes the new coincidence, this coincidence of doing and knowing, and that allows us to look at the objectifying concretion of the actualization of wanting or intentionality. The intent of wanting is taken as participle, as trying to get, and as participle it also alters our look at the agent, because the agent becomes replaced by the character of desirability, and intentionality as an entity becomes the activity of a participle. So now instead of agent and entity, we have character of desirability and participle. And that gives us a whole new way of looking at incarnation, the incarnation of this intention of desirability. And that becomes force. That becomes character plus participle as proairesis, that is force. Force is proairesis. And the Greek definition is someone who is for something where that intention is already made up in the mind as justified. Someone who is for something that is already made up in the mind. Ricoeur says the two language games can now coincide. The making happen of action and the happening as event reach coincidence in their language, language games. It also emphasizes the eschatological moment, and intentionality as an entity becomes the participle intending to. The intentional entity becomes participle intending to, and that erases the idea of possession. An agent cannot possess this powerful dunamis of intentionality as a thing. It cannot be possessed as a thing. And that was equally important to Ricoeur. He wanted to eliminate the idea of this intentionality as a possession of a entity. Instead, it's a participle of incarnation. It's a participle of the incarnate tendency of linking motive and action. So the moment that we reach, the doing, becomes the concretion of the action as historical event. Historical event occurs, we gather it up because it is reflexive. It reflects back to us. We gather in that which is unveiled. We evaluate it as true or false with regard to our held sign model and long-term memory. And then we provide that additional evaluation and revision. And so the wanting of meaning, or the wanting of an intended meaning, gathers up this reflection. And it's on the plane of action, but it's going to be gathered up and it's going to be taken back to the sign model for adjustments. And then it's going to be taken to the workspace of the posited virtual third subject. That workspace of universal narrative and revisions can be made there also as well to the narrative that is ongoing. But you can see right here that really the entire work is strongly emphasizing the second moment, and for Ricoeur, the work of praxis has to be something greater than a subject who can enclose it. It has to be something greater than a subject who can enclose these powerful aspects of praxis. Praxis has to have some objective reality to it, and it can have objective reality if we take up Aristotle's concept of Proairesis and say it's a participle coupled with a characterization. It's a participle coupled with a characterization where things are already made up in the mind. Things have already been concluded, at least with the first constructed sign model, but it is going to be open to revision, so there'll be many loops through the process and many revisions, and the sign model will become better refined as we continue. And not only that, but the narrative of universality will also be revised as needed. So powerful little lesson here. It's all about Proairesis for Ricoeur. To him, that's the key to the entire doctrine of praxis. And praxis can only be praxis knowledge for Ricoeur. We participate in history. Truth is unveiled in history. Truth is then actively gathered in the moment of return. It's not something passively received. It is actively retrieved in the return moment. And because active retrieving includes discernment about the truth or the falsehood of what's being gathered in. And then we can return to that long-term memory where we've got enclosed in our mind, check our sign model, and see if our sign model needs structural reevaluation or maybe content reevaluation. And then also we'll return to the concept of selfhood, and selfhood is in a separate workspace of its own called universal consciousness of the virtual third subject that's posited at the dialogue threshold. So we have a lot of work that goes on in return and in the regathering of that which is unveiled. That takes us up through page 70 now, but we've finally got our first firm look at praxis.